They called the Osage the richest people in America. And that's exactly when the killing began. At first, the deaths looked ordinary. A sickness here, an accident there, a body found where no one should have been walking. But the pattern was too precise, too profitable. Someone wasn't just murdering the Osage, they were inheriting them. Doctors ignored the signs. Lawmen looked away. The killers ate at the same tables as their victims and sent flowers to the funerals they caused. By the time the truth surfaced, entire families were gone, and the conspiracy reached deeper than anyone imagined. This isn't just a story of murder. It's a story of how greed makes ordinary people violent, and how a nation learned the truth only after the silence became impossible to ignore. In the closing decades of the 19th century, the Osage Nation stood at the intersection of survival and surrender, driven westward from ancestral homelands in Kansas. Under a sequence of federal treaties, they reached a plateau of rocky hills in Indian Territory that outsiders described as barren. The soil was thin, the prairie broken by limestone ridges and blackjack oaks, and even the nearest white settlers dismissed it as useless land. To the Osage, it represented endurance, a final refuge purchased with the last remnants of their fortune, and the exhaustion of generations uprooted by government decree. By the 1870s, they had accepted what they believed would be permanent isolation. Their reservation was divided among tribal members under an allotment roll, each holding individual rights to parcels that could not be sold without approval from Washington. It was protection by design, a measure to preserve the remnants of a nation stripped of nearly everything else. For decades, little changed. Small farming communities appeared near Pawhuska and Fairfax, where trading posts, schools and missions signaled the encroachment of American expansion. The Osage adapted within boundaries they did not design. They raised cattle, leased grazing rights, and followed the rhythms of reservation life in a territory slowly absorbed into the United States. The pace of that absorption accelerated when Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907. The Osage retained ownership of their reservation, a rare exception to the general policy of dissolving tribal lands. Under the leadership of Chief James Bighart and others, the tribe negotiated an unusual clause. They would keep collective ownership of the minerals beneath the surface. Every enrolled member, regardless of age or gender, received one head right, a share in the oil and gas royalties extracted from the land. No one yet imagined the scale of what lay beneath the shale and sandstone. At the turn of the century, prospectors drilled exploratory wells across Indian Territory. In 1897, the first successful strike came near Bartlesville, just east of Osage land. The boom spread quickly. Within a decade, derricks dotted the skyline from Hominy to Grey Horse. Oil leases auctioned under tribal supervision drew representatives of the largest petroleum companies in the nation. Journalists described the Osage as the richest people per capita on Earth. Families who had once lived in log cabins now drove automobiles imported from Detroit, built two-story houses with indoor plumbing, and hired white servants. They purchased grand pianos, phonographs, and the latest fashions shipped by rail from Kansas City. Annual head-right payments brought sums that rivaled industrial fortunes. Prosperity, however, brought surveillance. Federal policy still considered Native Americans wards of the government, incapable of managing large sums responsibly. The Department of the Interior appointed white guardians, lawyers, merchants, and businessmen from neighboring towns to oversee Osage finances. Under this system, most full-blooded Osage could not withdraw money, sell property, or make significant purchases without the signature of a guardian. The intent, officials said, was to protect them from exploitation. In practice, it became a legalized mechanism for theft. Guardians skimmed interest, diverted funds, and used their clients' accounts to secure their own debts. Each withdrawal required petition and approval, reducing wealthy Osage men and women to supplicants before county judges and bankers. The arrangement attracted opportunists from across the Midwest. They arrived by train, wearing new suits and carrying certificates of good character. Some sought legitimate business. Others pursued quick profit through fraud, marriage, or murder. County courthouses overflowed with guardianship petitions. Young white men courted Osage women with inheritances guaranteed by head rights. When marriages were recorded, the guardianship system placed financial control in the husband's hands. Within a generation, the reservation's economy rested on unstable alliances between the Osage families who held the wealth and the outsiders who managed it. By 1910, the reservation had become a paradox of affluence and dependency. Rows of oil tanks gleamed beside frame houses, while the roads filled with Cadillacs and horse-drawn wagons in the same view. Nighttime flares from drilling sites illuminated the hills. The wealth was undeniable, but so was the tension. Pawhuska's newspapers alternated between fascination and resentment. Editorials praised the oil boom, but derided what they called extravagance. Outsiders whispered that the Osage were wasting their money, that they needed discipline, that their good fortune was undeserved. Beneath polite conversation, greed fermented. Federal oversight expanded further. After reports of corruption reached Washington, investigations confirmed that many guardians treated Osage accounts as personal property, yet few were punished. The legal framework remained intact, upheld by local courts, dominated by the same businessmen who profited from it. In this environment, the line between legitimate business and criminal exploitation blurred completely. World War I brought another transformation. Oil from Osage County fueled American industry, and the Allied war effort. The tribe's income soared even higher. But as the war ended, a national economic downturn shifted the balance. Farmers and small towns across Oklahoma faced debt and deflation, while Osage royalty checks continued uninterrupted. Resentment hardened into hatred. Stories circulated of shootings, sudden illnesses, and suspicious accidents among Osage families. The deaths were rarely investigated beyond cursory reports. County coroners, often untrained or connected to local power brokers, signed certificates listing natural causes or intoxication. Each death transferred head rights through wills and marriages, concentrating wealth into fewer hands. By the early 1920s, the network of opportunists had matured into a hierarchy. At its center stood William K. Hale, a former Texas rancher who had arrived in Osage County decades earlier with little money and great ambition. Through cattle trading loans and political maneuvering, Hale cultivated influence over law enforcement, banks, and the courts. He presented himself as a benefactor to the Osage, contributing to churches and schools while controlling insurance companies and property deeds through proxies. Around him operated a circle of relatives and associates who owed their prosperity to his patronage. His nephew, Ernest Burkhart, married Molly Kyle, an Osage woman from one of the wealthiest families in Gray Horse. The union tied Hale directly to head rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Meanwhile, the pattern of deaths continued. Some were quiet, fevers that advanced rapidly, hearts that failed without warning, vehicles found overturned on country roads. Others were violent and conspicuous. In 1921, a hunter discovered the decomposed body of Anna Brown, Molly's sister, in a ravine. The county sheriff concluded it was a case of exposure, an accident brought on by drink. No autopsy was ordered. A local undertaker, preparing the body for burial, noticed a small hole at the base of the skull, but said nothing publicly. Within months, Anna's mother, Lizzie Q., succumbed to a lingering illness that doctors described as old age but neighbors suspected as poisoning. The family buried her beside her daughter and tried to continue life amid the growing unease. 2 years later, Molly's cousin, Henry Roan, was found in his car with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. The motive was unclear until investigators discovered a life insurance policy, naming William Hale as the sole beneficiary. The atmosphere in Osage County deteriorated into fear. More deaths followed, some Osage, some white associates who knew too much. A lawyer named W.W. Vaughn collected affidavits linking local businessmen to the murders and boarded a train for Oklahoma City to deliver them to authorities. He never arrived. His body was later found along the tracks with a broken neck. Newspapers called it coincidence, another in a series of tragedies that no one could explain. The Osage Tribal Council convened emergency meetings and appealed directly to the federal government for help. Their letters described a community under siege, its members dying one by one, while county officials looked away. They requested federal agents to investigate, arguing that local law enforcement was compromised. Months passed before Washington responded. In 1923, the Bureau of Investigation, an agency still in its formative years, dispatched a small team to Oklahoma. The agents who arrived in Osage County found a society divided by fear and corruption. Witnesses refused to speak. Records vanished from courthouse files. Coroner's reports contradicted themselves. The agents understood that the killings were not random but systemic, a campaign sustained by greed and protected by silence. The Bureau's presence signaled the beginning of a new era of federal intervention. But in 1921, as Anna Brown's coffin was lowered into the ground, none of that was yet visible. From the reservation's perspective, history had looped upon itself. A century earlier, the Osage had surrendered fertile lands to survive. Now their refuge had turned into a trap woven from wealth. The same government that once exiled them now administered their fortune through appointed guardians. The same outsiders who called them wards now controlled their estates. Beneath the oil that enriched the hills lay the deeper sediment of betrayal. By summer's end, the killings had become too numerous to ignore. Entire family lines thinned, leaving surviving heirs disoriented and alone. Insurance investigators came and went. Reporters published brief items buried on inside pages. Rumors described plots involving inheritance, forged wills, and hired killers. Still, no one was charged. The machinery of local justice remained motionless. Across the prairie, derricks continued to pump, the mechanical rhythm indifferent to the funerals it financed. In Pawhuska, merchants balanced ledgers, filled with Osage deposits. At night, the glare from gas flares illuminated the hills with a dull orange haze, visible for miles. It was light without warmth, wealth without safety, prosperity shadowed by predation. For outsiders, The Osage represented a paradox of success and dependency, a reminder of the contradictions within American progress. To the tribe itself, the wealth was both armor and target. By 1921, they understood that the danger no longer came from forced removal or open warfare, but from within the very structure of legality that governed their lives. The Reign of Terror had not yet been named, but its machinery was already in motion. The coming years would reveal that the murders of Anna Brown and her kin were part of a broader pattern reaching through banks, courts, and marriages, a system in which human life could be converted into mineral revenue through inheritance law. But at the dawn of that decade, the outlines remained hidden, concealed beneath layers of deference and denial. When the Bureau's telegram finally arrived granting authorization for a federal investigation, nearly 24 Osage deaths had already occurred under suspicious circumstances. The discovery of Anna Brown's bullet wound marked the threshold between rumor and proof, between private grief and public crime. It was the moment when the quiet accumulation of bodies became impossible to dismiss. In retrospect, historians would frame these years as a turning point, both for the Osage Nation and for federal law enforcement. The murders forced the young Bureau of Investigation to confront organized conspiracy and political corruption on a scale it had never faced. They also forced the United States to acknowledge that even its wards, protected by treaty, could be destroyed by the greed of those entrusted with their care. The Reign of Terror would last several more years, consuming lives and exposing the fragility of justice in the American heartland. Yet its origins lay not in a single act of violence, but in the century of displacement, legal manipulation, and economic dependency that preceded it. Every oil well that glittered under the Oklahoma sun drew from that buried history, a lineage of broken promises converted into black wealth. By the time the first federal agents stepped off the train in Pawhuska, the Osage had already paid the price for their own prosperity. What began as survival on barren land had transformed into one of the darkest chapters in modern American history. The hills that once seemed worthless had yielded fortune beyond measure, and with it, the blood of those who owned it. In early May 1921, spring storms rolled over the plains of northern Oklahoma, saturating the ravines and red clay roads that wound through the Osage Hills. The new season brought both growth and unease. Oil still rose from the ground in black fountains, feeding derricks that creaked through the night. But beneath the mechanical rhythm was a silence that felt heavier than the rain. The community of Gray Horse, once a quiet cluster of frame houses and stores, had become a settlement of moneyed families guarded by suspicion. Beneath the fine automobiles and imported furnishings lay fear, the kind that does not announce itself, but lives in the way neighbors watch one another from their porches. Anna Brown had been missing for more than a week before anyone thought to organize a search. She was known for her social life, often visiting Pawhuska and Fairfax to attend dances or drive with friends. When her absence extended beyond a few days, family members assumed she had gone to stay with acquaintances. Molly Burkhart, her younger sister, grew restless. Each inquiry returned the same answers: no sightings, no word. Then, on May 28, two men riding along a dry creek bed southwest of Fairfax noticed a vulture circling above the trees. When they descended the slope, they found a human body lodged among the rocks, swollen by exposure and rain. The county sheriff arrived late in the afternoon, traveling by wagon through the mud. The heat and decay made examination difficult. With little effort, he concluded the woman had died from alcohol and exposure. The undertaker who collected the remains identified the body by clothing and jewelry as Anna Brown, daughter of Lizzie Q. Kyle of Gray Horse. The official record listed accidental death. No autopsy was ordered. The case was closed within hours. When the body reached the small chapel in Fairfax, the undertaker worked quietly to prepare it for burial. During the washing, he noticed a circular indentation near the base of the skull. Small, almost invisible beneath the discoloration. He made a note to himself, but told no one. The death of an Osage woman, even one of means, seldom stirred the county offices. There were papers to file, forms to stamp, and other matters that paid better attention. Molly Burkhart arrived for the funeral 2 days later, accompanied by her husband Ernest and several relatives. The heat in the church was oppressive, and the air carried the odor of embalming fluid. Behind the solemn procession stood a handful of white townspeople who came out of curiosity rather than sympathy. Reporters from Pawhuska scribbled brief notes describing Anna Brown as another victim of reckless living. None questioned the circumstances of her disappearance. In the days that followed, the household on Grand Avenue filled with mourners. Molly's mother, Lizzie Q., sat near the window, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth, her face drawn from illness and grief. She was in her 70s and had endured decades of displacement. This latest loss seemed to erase what strength remained. Friends visited with gifts and food, speaking quietly about accidents, alcohol, and bad luck. Beneath those conversations, ran a current of fear. Anna's death was not the first unexplained tragedy among Osage families that year. Others had been found dead on remote roads, in creeks, or in their beds with no cause recorded, beyond vague phrases, like congestion, or decline. Outside observers saw coincidence. The Osage saw a pattern. Each death transferred property, insurance, or head rights. Each left someone wealthier. The logic was too precise to ignore. Yet no one dared to accuse anyone directly. The guardianship system and local courts ensured that justice flowed in only one direction. Weeks passed. Newspapers in Tulsa and Oklahoma City ran brief items under headings such as Indian woman found dead or mystery in the hills, then moved on to other stories. The oil fields continued their relentless output. Surveyors drove new stakes into the ground. Drillers filled the nights with hammering. For the federal agents stationed in the region to monitor leases, the death registered as an isolated event. Only within the Osage community did the unease deepen into certainty that something larger was unfolding. By midsummer, rumors reached Pawhuska that Lizzie Q. Kyle had taken ill. Neighbors recalled that her health had declined since Anna's burial. Doctors diagnosed anemia, perhaps complications from age. Her symptoms grew worse each week: dizziness, fatigue, loss of appetite. Molly moved her mother into her own house to provide care. Ernest managed the arrangements with efficiency, obtaining medicine through town contacts and handling correspondence with the guardianship office. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Lizzie's condition deteriorated with a speed that defied explanation. Visitors noted the strange discoloration of her skin and the metallic taste she complained of after meals. The attending physician offered little guidance, prescribing rest and tonics. In August 1921, she slipped into unconsciousness and died quietly in her bed. The certificate listed natural causes. She was buried beside Anna, in the family plot overlooking the hills that had made them wealthy. Within 2 months, 2 generations of the same family were gone. The estate papers required signatures from county officials and guardians. Head rights shifted accordingly. Molly, now the principal heir, inherited additional shares in oil revenues. Her annual income rose to levels that few Americans could imagine. Outwardly, she lived the same life: carriage rides, social gatherings, church attendance. But within her household, anxiety hardened into vigilance. Across Osage County, similar stories accumulated. The deaths of prominent Osage men and women, often middle-aged and healthy, became a grim rhythm. A few cases drew brief investigations. None led to indictments. Local juries, composed entirely of white residents, saw no crime in the deaths of Indians who drank too much or kept questionable company. Each closed case reinforced the belief that the system would not protect them. The federal government maintained a posture of distance. The Bureau of Indian Affairs collected royalties and distributed payments, but lacked authority to prosecute local crimes. County sheriffs answered to voters who owed their livelihoods to oil money flowing through Hale's banks and businesses. The machinery of governance turned efficiently, and within its gears, people disappeared. In Grey Horse, Molly Burkhart's home became both refuge and target. Friends visited frequently, checking on her health and that of her remaining sisters, Rita Smith and Minnie. Conversations often returned to the same question: who benefited from Anna's death, and now from Lizzie's? Each answer led back through a web of marriages and guardianships to white intermediaries, who managed Osage fortunes. Outside the reservation, the world took little notice. In Washington, Congress debated appropriations for the Interior Department. In Tulsa, new refineries processed crude from Osage wells. The profits enriched the state economy, while the tribe's population quietly declined. By the end of 1921, at least 8 unexplained Osage deaths had been recorded in Fairfax alone. Among those deaths, Anna Brown stood as a warning: unanswered, uninvestigated, and soon nearly forgotten. The only physical evidence, the mark on her skull, had been erased during burial. Without witnesses or motive, there was nothing for law enforcement to pursue. What remained was a community increasingly isolated within its own success. As autumn advanced, heavy rains returned, turning the unpaved roads into rivers of mud. Mail wagons sank axle deep, telegraph lines failed. In the isolation of that season, fear became a private affair. Families kept ledgers of their own, noting which relatives had died and which beneficiaries had prospered. The pattern grew undeniable, yet still unspoken. Lizzie Q. Kyle's death closed the first chapter of a tragedy that few yet recognized as a coordinated campaign. In official records, her passing appeared as another line in a ledger: a wealthy Indian woman succumbing to natural illness. In reality, it signaled the continuation of a sequence that would, within 2 years, engulf the entire Osage Nation. For Molly, the losses etched a quiet resolve. She continued the routines of daily life, attending church, signing checks, receiving guests. The outward composure hid the constant tension of a woman watching the world narrow around her. She had seen her sister vanish into the ravine, and her mother follow soon after. The pattern was too clear to ignore, but the power to change it lay beyond her reach. As winter approached, the prairie cooled under the weight of another oil boom. New drilling permits were issued, more derricks rose, and the wealth of the Osage expanded alongside their peril. In distant offices, bank ledgers recorded surging deposits under Osage names. In quiet cemeteries, new headstones appeared bearing those same names. The two developments advanced in perfect parallel, bound by the same logic of greed and impunity. The local press moved on to other matters: railway strikes, state politics, prohibition raids. The deaths in Osage County faded from headlines until the next body appeared. For now, there was only silence, broken by the rhythmic hiss of oil burning off in the night, and the sound of rain against tin roofs. No one yet called it the Reign of Terror. It was simply the way things were. Accidents, coincidences, misfortunes that accumulated too quickly to be natural. The county's white elite counted profits, while the Osage buried their dead. Between them stood the thin paper shield of official documentation: death certificates, guardianship forms, and probate records, all stamped and filed, all perfectly legal. The deaths of Anna Brown and Lizzie Q. Kyle marked the beginning of a transformation that would expose the limits of American justice in the heart of its newest state. In the months that followed, the pattern would widen, drawing in bankers, lawyers, and men who called themselves friends. For now, the evidence lay buried beneath red clay and sealed coffins. The hills that hid the oil also hid the truth, and both continued to yield profit for those who knew how to take it. The winter of 1921 settled cold over the Osage Hills, pressing the land into stillness. Oil wells kept burning through the season, flames rising against the gray sky like small suns over the snow. The derricks did not stop for mourning. Beneath their shadows, the Osage buried more of their own. Each funeral drew fewer questions, as if exhaustion had replaced outrage. The deaths of Anna Brown and her mother, Lizzie Q. Kyle, had not been investigated beyond the paperwork required for probate. The estate division was completed by February, witnessed by the county clerk and signed with perfunctory efficiency. Molly Burkhart now held multiple head rights and a steady stream of royalty checks that arrived as regularly as the seasons. On paper, she was one of the wealthiest women in Oklahoma. In practice, her fortune was controlled by the guardianship system and the unseen hands behind it. Within the walls of her home, grief moved like a quiet contagion. Molly cared for her two surviving sisters, Minnie and Rita, each of whom had inherited smaller but significant shares of the family estate. Their lives, once marked by prosperity, now felt contained by dread. Visitors noticed the drawn curtains and the frequent presence of doctors. Illness became the language through which fear expressed itself. In September 1921, Minnie Smith, the eldest of the sisters, began to show symptoms similar to those that had afflicted their mother. She grew pale and weak, unable to keep food down. Her husband, Bill Smith, brought physicians from Fairfax and Pawhuska. They diagnosed a wasting illness of uncertain origin. The treatments did nothing. By late September, Minnie was confined to her bed, her weight dropping steadily. On the 22nd, she died just before dawn. Her death certificate, signed by the same physician who had attended Lizzie Q., cited peculiar wasting disease as the cause. No autopsy followed. At the funeral, Molly stood beside the casket, her face a mask of composure. Her remaining sister, Rita, wept openly. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and kerosene lamps. Outside the church, automobiles lined the road, driven by guardians, bankers, and businessmen who came to pay formal respects. The ceremony lasted less than an hour. By evening, the guests dispersed, and the silence of Grey Horse resumed. 3 deaths within one family, in less than a year, each unexplained, each beneficial to someone else, did not go unnoticed among the Osage. The pattern was discussed in whispers at church gatherings and tribal meetings, yet no one approached law enforcement. The sheriff's office had already shown its indifference, and the federal agencies claimed no jurisdiction. To accuse without evidence was to invite retaliation. People learned to keep their suspicions private. Farther north in Fairfax, William K. Hale continued to expand his empire. The cattle rancher, banker, and civic benefactor presented himself as the model citizen of Osage County. He financed the construction of churches, donated to local fairs, and served as patron for young entrepreneurs. Behind these gestures, he maintained a network of influence that reached into nearly every institution. The bank that held Osage deposits, the lawyers who managed estates, the doctors who signed certificates, and the county judges who approved guardianships. His nephew, Ernest Burkhart, remained loyal, living comfortably with Molly and managing their finances under Hale's direction. The arrangement served multiple purposes. Hale's reputation as a friend of the Osage protected him from scrutiny, while Ernest's marriage tied him directly to one of the wealthiest surviving families. Every death within the Kyle lineage consolidated more head rights under Molly's name, and by extension, within Ernest's household. Hale's control was invisible yet absolute. Through the winter months of 1922, the body count in Osage County continued to rise. Some victims were found dead in their homes. Others were discovered by the roadside or in fields. The causes were varied. gunshot wounds, suspected poisonings, unexplained collapses. Local papers carried the reports in small columns, beneath advertisements for motor cars and household goods. The frequency dulled public attention. Murder, once extraordinary, became routine. Among the dead that season was George Bighart, an Osage man with considerable holdings. He died suddenly, after dining in Fairfax. Rumors suggested poisoning. Before his death, Bighart had confided suspicions to his attorney, W. W. Vaughn, claiming he possessed evidence of a conspiracy to kill wealthy Osage citizens for their head rights. Vaughn retrieved documents and boarded a train for Oklahoma City to present them to state authorities. He never arrived. The next morning, his body was found alongside the tracks near Pawhuska. His briefcase was missing. The coroner ruled accidental fall. These events, occurring within months of one another, deepened the sense that invisible forces were arranging the deaths. Yet the machinery of investigation remained motionless. Hale's influence extended too far, and his reputation insulated him from inquiry. For the Osage, the law had become part of the conspiracy. Amid the rising tension, another tragedy struck. In February 1923, Henry Roan, a cousin of Molly Burkhart, and a man once close to her family, was found dead in his automobile on a rural road. A bullet had entered the back of his head. The case was initially treated as robbery, until investigators discovered his wallet intact. Within days, it emerged that a life insurance policy, worth $25,000, had been purchased in his name months earlier. With William K. Hale listed as sole beneficiary, the connection should have prompted immediate investigation. Instead, county authorities accepted Hale's statement that Roan had owed him money, and the policy served as collateral. The explanation was recorded, filed, and forgotten. For Molly, the death of Henry Roan carried personal weight. He had been a trusted family friend, often visiting her home. His murder removed one of the few remaining men who might have defended the family's interests. It also marked a shift in the pattern of killings, from subtle poisonings and staged accidents to open gunfire. The violence had grown bolder, more confident in its immunity. At night, the oil fields continued to burn with steady light. The rhythmic hiss of gas flares became a constant presence across the prairie, a reminder of wealth that never slept. Beneath that glow, the Osage gathered in small groups, speaking quietly about wills, inheritances, and threats. Fear became the background noise of daily life. Many stopped traveling after dark. Others hired white guards or moved to larger towns, believing proximity to law enforcement would offer safety. It did not. Through 1922, the guardianship system reached its most corrupt form. Federal auditors documented instances of embezzlement, false billing, and property theft. Yet prosecutions were rare. Guardians held political and financial power. Judges depended on them for campaign support. The deaths of wealthy Osage clients simplified account management. Each passing reduced oversight, consolidated estates, and enriched intermediaries. The Osage Tribal Council attempted to appeal again to Washington, submitting petitions describing the pattern of murders and fraud. The Bureau of Indian Affairs acknowledged receipt, but took no immediate action. Officials in Washington considered the matter a local issue under state jurisdiction. The request for federal investigators went unanswered for months. In Fairfax, Hale's confidence grew. He attended church services, spoke at civic banquets, and offered public rewards for information on the murders, rewards that no one ever claimed. His gestures reinforced the illusion that he was a victim of the same lawlessness threatening the community. Meanwhile, his ranch prospered, his loans expanded, and his connections deepened. By late 1922, Molly Burkhart's health began to falter. She suffered from recurring fatigue and dizziness, symptoms attributed to diabetes. Her insulin treatments, administered by local doctors under earnest supervision, seemed to worsen her condition rather than improve it. She endured alternating periods of weakness and recovery, unaware that her medicine may have been tampered with. The illness further isolated her, keeping her confined to the house while deaths continued around her. Rita Smith, the last surviving sister, remained vigilant. She and her husband, Bill, moved to a newly built home on the outskirts of Fairfax. The structure was larger, sturdier, and designed for safety, but the precautions would soon prove futile. For the moment, it represented hope, a sense that distance from the family home might break the sequence of deaths. Molly visited when her health allowed, carrying the quiet dread that accompanied her everywhere. In December 1922, another funeral took place in Grey Horse. The deceased, an elder named Red Eagle, had been found dead after returning from a meeting with bankers in Pawhuska. His death added to the growing list of unsolved cases. The newspapers did not bother to mention it. By the year's end, the tally of suspicious deaths among the Osage approached 20. The total number remained uncertain, because many were recorded under vague medical causes: heart failure, pneumonia, alcohol poisoning. Each certificate concealed the absence of investigation behind medical terminology. The community existed in a dual reality: publicly prosperous, privately terrorized. In Washington, a small number of officials within the Bureau of Investigation began to take notice. Reports from Osage County mentioned repeated murders and the possibility of insurance fraud involving white businessmen. Yet the agency was young, its mandate narrow, and its resources limited. The cases would remain dormant until public pressure and the persistence of the Osage Council forced action months later. For now, the terror remained local and unacknowledged. Hale's network operated with quiet precision, each killing executed to appear accidental or untraceable. The cumulative effect was devastating. By eliminating key heirs and witnesses, the conspirators positioned themselves to control vast portions of the Osage mineral estate. When the new year of 1923 began, the weather turned mild, the hills softened under early spring rain, and the first grass appeared between the rocks. On the surface, life continued. Businesses reopened, leases were signed, and dividends distributed. Beneath that surface, the list of the dead lengthened. Molly's family, once large and secure, had been reduced to a handful of survivors. The funeral of Minnie Smith, followed months later by that of Henry Roan, completed the cycle that had begun with Anna Brown. 3 generations of the same extended family now rested under the Oklahoma soil, each death closing one door in a corridor that led inevitably toward the next. The county ledger showed prosperity. The graveyards told another story. By the spring of 1923, the Osage were both the richest and the most endangered people in the region. Their tragedy remained invisible to the nation beyond the prairie. The agents who would one day uncover its machinery had not yet arrived, and those responsible felt no need for concealment. As the season turned, the remaining branches of the Kyle family gathered less frequently. The weight of grief silenced conversation. Molly remained confined by illness. Rita retreated to her new home, and the empty spaces left by their mother and sister hung in the air like unfinished sentences. In the towns beyond the reservation, life continued without interruption. The oil derricks marked time with their ceaseless motion, indifferent to the history unfolding beneath them. Each barrel extracted from the ground carried traces of the lives consumed to obtain it. The wealth that once symbolized endurance had become the instrument of destruction. By the end of 1922, the reign of terror was fully underway, though no one had yet named it. By the spring of 1923, Osage County had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a place where oil derricks dominated the horizon, and funerals filled the calendar. Each month brought a new death, recorded in official ledgers with routine precision. Gunshot wounds, sudden illnesses, and unexplained accidents had become ordinary entries in the county register. Life continued between the ceremonies of burial, as though grief had been woven into the pattern of prosperity. Rita Smith and her husband Bill tried to live beyond that pattern. After the deaths of Anna, Lizzie, and Minnie, they had built a brick home on the outskirts of Fairfax, a deliberate attempt at safety. The structure stood solid and symmetrical, with broad steps leading to a porch that overlooked the rolling hills. They believed that distance and caution would protect them. Bill had taken additional precautions, locking doors, screening visitors, and avoiding travel after dark. In Osage County, such habits had become as common as church attendance. On the night of March 10, 1923, the calm broke. Just before sunrise, an explosion tore through the Smith residence. Neighbors several miles away felt the concussion. The blast shattered windows across the town and sent a column of smoke rising above the hills. When rescuers reached the site, they found nothing resembling a house. Bricks and timbers were scattered across the yard. Fragments of furniture lay embedded in the soil. The bodies of Bill and Rita Smith were recovered from the ruins. A servant, sleeping nearby, was also killed. The explosion's cause was immediately evident to anyone who examined the wreckage. The destruction was too complete for a gas leak. Investigators found traces of nitroglycerin embedded in the foundation stones, a material used in oil field blasting. The device had been placed beneath the floor near the bedroom. The intent was unmistakable. The morning newspapers carried the story across Oklahoma. Headlines spoke of mystery blast in Osage Hills. Reporters arrived from Tulsa and Oklahoma City, photographing the ruins and interviewing locals. Officials offered no explanation. The sheriff announced an inquiry, but no arrests followed. Within days, the story slipped from the front page, replaced by coverage of oil prices and legislative debates. For the Osage, the bombing marked the end of denial. What had been whispered as rumor now stood as proof. Someone was killing their people systematically, without fear of consequence. The Smiths' deaths made that truth undeniable. The scale of violence had escalated from poison and bullets to explosives, from secrecy to spectacle. Molly Burkhart, already weakened by illness, received the news from her bed. The shock deepened her condition. Doctors diagnosed complications from diabetes. Her insulin injections, administered regularly, left her dizzy and faint. Each treatment seemed to worsen her symptoms. Those around her accepted the decline as inevitable, unaware that her medicine had likely been tampered with. Within the Osage community, fear solidified into paralysis. Families who had once gathered for dances and picnics now avoided public events. Doors were bolted even in daylight. Trust evaporated. Every visitor, banker and doctor was regarded with suspicion. The social order that had defined reservation life for decades dissolved under the weight of terror. In Fairfax, public reaction was more restrained. White residents discussed the bombing in practical terms: insurance claims, property values, and business interruptions. Some expressed sympathy. Others dismissed the deaths as the result of reckless living. Few connected them to the broader pattern that by then had claimed dozens of lives. Behind the public indifference, the machinery of exploitation continued undisturbed. Guardianship records show no interruption in transactions. Estates were settled, head rights reassigned, royalties collected. The deaths simplified paperwork rather than complicating it. The legal framework functioned perfectly. Only its moral foundation had collapsed. The Osage Tribal Council convened an emergency meeting in Pawhuska. The surviving members, alarmed by the escalation, drafted a petition to the federal government, requesting direct intervention. The document detailed years of unexplained deaths, named the victims, and accused local law enforcement of inaction. It cited corruption in the courts, and demanded that federal agents be dispatched to investigate. The council sent copies to the Department of the Interior and to Washington representatives. For weeks, they received no reply. In April, tribal representatives traveled to Washington, D.C. to plead their case in person. They described a community living under siege, its members dying one by one. Officials listened politely and promised review. Bureaucratic channels moved slowly, as they always did. The letters returned to Pawhuska contained acknowledgments but no action. Meanwhile, in Osage County, the pattern of violence expanded. Another man, an Osage named Joe Bates, was found shot along a rural road. His death was attributed to robbery, though his money and watch remained untouched. A young woman, Rose Osage, died after drinking from a contaminated bottle of whiskey. The coroner listed acute gastritis. Each incident added to the growing list of suspicious fatalities. William Hale remained a constant presence through it all. He visited Molly during her illness, attended the Smiths' funeral, and publicly offered a reward for information about the bombing. His gestures reinforced the image of a benevolent friend to the Osage, a man seeking justice rather than avoiding it. Privately, he continued to tighten his control over estates and guardianships, positioning himself at the center of the financial network that profited from every death. The county's political structure ensured his protection. Hale's associates occupied key positions. The sheriff, the prosecutor, and several judges owed him favors or money. Investigators who showed curiosity found themselves reassigned or threatened. Witnesses who spoke too freely disappeared. The pattern of silence was complete. By mid-1923, national newspapers began to take notice. A few articles in Eastern publications described the murders as a reign of terror among the Osage. The phrase captured the reality that locals would not speak aloud. The combination of wealth, race, and lawlessness intrigued distant readers, but produced little change. No federal agency claimed responsibility. The Bureau of Investigation, still small and uncertain of its jurisdiction, hesitated to act without explicit authorization. Within the Osage Nation, the cumulative losses reached a point of crisis. Entire families had been extinguished. The living counted their wealth and ledgers, but measured their fear in funerals. Churches filled every weekend with new ceremonies. Coffins arrived by wagon, each one a ledger entry closed. In Fairfax, Molly's condition worsened. She drifted between consciousness and fever, her body weakened by the steady poisoning of her system. Ernest remained dutiful, managing the household and consulting doctors, all under Hale's guidance. The outward appearance was one of care. The reality, another link in the chain of control. Molly Burkhart, recovering slowly, was one of the few survivors of her immediate family. She was also, unknowingly, the central figure in a network of inheritance that linked directly to William Hale. The deaths of her sisters, mother, and cousin had positioned her as sole heir to multiple head rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Her illness had nearly removed the last obstacle to their complete control. As the year closed, the hills grew silent again. Winter returned with a hard wind that stripped the trees bare. The oil flares burned through the nights, indifferent as ever. To passing travelers, Osage County looked prosperous and peaceful. The newspapers spoke of progress, of record oil production, and of civic growth. Beneath that image lay a graveyard of names erased for profit. The explosion on Grand Avenue had been both climax and catalyst. It forced recognition of a reality too long ignored. The wealth that made the Osage powerful had also made them prey. From the ashes of the Smith home, the trail of smoke extended far beyond Oklahoma, reaching to Washington and the infancy of the federal investigative system. The Bureau of Investigation, still untested, would soon step into the void left by local law. The struggle that followed would reshape the meaning of justice in modern America. For the Osage Nation, the explosion marked the midpoint of their descent. It had taken 2 years to move from suspicion to terror, and it would take many more for the truth to surface. The air over the ruins carried the scent of oil and dust, mingled with the memory of everything lost. In that silence, history pivoted toward the slow machinery of federal response. The murders had ceased to be local tragedy. They had become a national disgrace. The Bureau of Investigation entered the Osage case in quiet increments, rather than sudden arrival. Its authorization, granted late in 1923, came with no ceremony, just a memorandum signed in Washington and transmitted to the field office in Houston. The order named Agent Tom White as lead investigator. At that time, the Bureau was a modest institution, its agents unarmed, its authority uncertain, its reputation still forming. White, a former Texas Ranger, brought experience from an older era of law enforcement, defined by endurance, not bureaucracy. He began with little more than newspaper clippings and fragments of correspondence from the Osage Tribal Council. The reports were disjointed. Lists of the dead, rumors of poisonings, vague references to life insurance policies, and inheritance transfers. White recognized the pattern immediately. It was not random violence, but systemic elimination, motivated by profit. To prove it, he needed evidence buried beneath years of falsified paperwork, bribed officials, and silence enforced by fear. By early 1924, White assembled a team of 4 agents: John Berger, Frank Smith, John Wren, and a man known in bureau files as Agent 1, whose background in undercover work would be essential. They traveled separately to Oklahoma, avoiding attention. The plan was simple: blend into the fabric of Osage County, observe and gather testimony from those who would not speak to local law. When White arrived in Pawhuska, the town bore no sign of crisis. The oil boom had insulated it from the national downturn. Banks thrived, businesses expanded, and the streets bustled with traders. Yet beneath the surface, the pall of fear persisted. Families of the murdered lived cautiously, their wealth now an inheritance, tainted by death. The sheriff's office offered perfunctory cooperation. County officials denied knowledge of any conspiracy. White understood that local institutions were compromised, and that his investigation would need to bypass them entirely. He rented a modest office under the name of an insurance adjuster, and began the slow process of building trust. His agents took on false identities: a cattle buyer, an oil prospector, a ranch hand, and a traveling herbal doctor. The disguises allowed them to move among both Osage residents and white businessmen without drawing attention. Each man carried a notebook, disguised as a ledger. They recorded observations on property transfers, marriages, and loans. Weeks turned into months. The pattern that emerged confirmed White's suspicions. Many of the murdered Osage had financial connections to William K. Hale. Life insurance policies, loans, and guardianship accounts formed an intricate web linking him to nearly every major death. His nephew Ernest Burkhart appeared repeatedly in the records, his signature present on documents related to the estates of Anna Brown, Lizzie Q. Kyle, and the Smiths. The paper trail was precise, legal, and damning. Despite the progress, White faced obstacles at every turn. Witnesses feared retribution. Clerks misplaced files. Local police monitored the movements of his men. Hale's influence extended deep into the community. His reputation as benefactor shielded him from suspicion. He continued to attend church services, host social events, and make public donations. The facade of respectability held firm. White countered with methodical persistence. He traced insurance payments, interviewed bankers, and verified alibis. The Bureau's field reports from that period describe a landscape of intimidation. One banker refused to open records until federal subpoenas arrived. Another vanished before he could testify. The agents learned to work discreetly, sharing information only among themselves, and trusted contacts in Washington. Among the surviving Osage, trust in the Bureau developed slowly. They had seen investigators before, private detectives hired by the tribe or by individuals, many of whom had been bribed or frightened away. White's team distinguished itself by its patience and integrity. They attended funerals, visited homes, and listened more than they spoke. Over time, families began to share details that had been withheld for years: suspicions of poisoning, unexplained visitors, altered wills. Each testimony filled another gap in the timeline of the murders. The breakthrough came through financial documentation. White's analysis of county probate records revealed a sequence of estate consolidations that always led back to the same cluster of individuals. Hale, through his businesses and family ties, profited directly from each death in the Burkhart family. The pattern was undeniable, but circumstantial. To secure convictions, the Bureau needed confessions or eyewitness accounts. By late 1924, White's agents identified 2 men rumored to have participated in the killings: John Ramsey, a ranch hand with criminal history, and Kelsey Morrison, a former lawman turned outlaw. Both had ties to Hale's ranching operations. Surveillance confirmed meetings between them and Hale. In the months preceding key murders, the Bureau intensified pressure, using informants to spread rumors that one of the conspirators was cooperating. The tactic produced results. In early 1925, John Ramsey broke the silence. He admitted involvement in the murder of Henry Roan, describing how he had driven the victim to a remote location and shot him in the head on Hale's instructions. The payment, he said, came from insurance money collected by Hale. Ramsey's statement, while incomplete, provided the first direct link between Hale and the killings. Hale's reaction was swift. He hired prominent defense attorneys, accused the Bureau of harassment, and launched a public campaign to portray himself as a victim of political persecution. Local newspapers printed his statements alongside editorials, questioning federal overreach. The community divided along familiar lines: those who saw Hale as protector of local interests, and those who feared him. White pressed on. He secured arrest warrants for Hale, Ernest Burkhart, John Ramsey, and others implicated in the conspiracy. The arrests were carried out quietly. In the spring of 1925, Hale was taken from his ranch without resistance, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had characterized him throughout the investigation. Ernest Burkhart was detained separately in Fairfax. The legal process that followed revealed the extent of the corruption. Local courts attempted to delay proceedings, citing jurisdictional disputes. Hale's lawyers filed motions to dismiss, challenging federal authority over crimes committed on Osage land. The Bureau countered with evidence that the murders occurred under federal jurisdiction because they involved native victims and interstate financial instruments, such as insurance policies. The argument prevailed, allowing the case to move forward in federal court. As the trials approached, White intensified his efforts to secure cooperation from Ernest Burkhart. The younger man faced overwhelming evidence, linking him to the conspiracy through forged documents and witness testimony. Under pressure, he began to talk. His statements confirmed Hale's role as mastermind behind multiple murders, including those of Anna Brown, the Smiths, and Henry Roan. He described how explosives had been placed under the Smith home, and how Hale had ordered the deaths to consolidate inheritance under Molly's name. For the Osage, the arrival of Tom White and his agents marked the first intrusion of real authority in a decade of lawlessness. Their presence did not erase the losses, but it ended the certainty that murder would remain unpunished. In that small shift, from hopelessness to resistance, the long pursuit of justice began. By early 1925, the Bureau's investigation had reached a critical threshold. The groundwork laid by Tom White and his agents had produced more than suspicion. It had built a lattice of verifiable connections between William K. Hale and a chain of deliberate murders. The evidence was both financial and testimonial, each document and confession tightening around Hale like an invisible cord. The challenge was no longer uncovering the conspiracy, but ensuring that the truth could survive the weight of the system built to protect it. The Osage case had become a test of endurance. For nearly 4 years, the deaths had continued unchecked, while officials hesitated to intervene. Now the Bureau faced the opposite danger, a backlash from those whose livelihoods depended on silence. Hale still commanded influence across Osage County. His loans underwrote local ranches, his donations funded schools and churches, and his reputation as the king of the Osage Hills remained intact among many settlers. To them, he was a man who had risen from modest means through industry and generosity. The charges of murder seemed inconceivable. Tom White understood that public perception could derail the case as effectively as corruption. He instructed his agents to maintain secrecy, to avoid the press, and to present their evidence in precise, unemotional terms. Each statement, each exhibit, had to withstand scrutiny in federal court. The Bureau collected hundreds of depositions from witnesses scattered across Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas. Many required protection. Others demanded anonymity. The confessions from Ernest Burkhart and John Ramsey formed the spine of the case. Ramsey's admission to the murder of Henry Roan was corroborated by records showing the life insurance policy with Hale as beneficiary. The policy itself bore Hale's signature, an indelible link between motive and act. Burkhart's testimony, obtained after weeks of pressure and corroboration, extended the chain of guilt to the murders of Anna Brown and the Smith family. His account described how explosives had been planted beneath the Smith residence and how Hale had ordered the act to ensure the inheritance passed to Molly Burkhart. These statements transformed Hale from a suspect to a conspirator of national infamy. Yet even as the Bureau prepared indictments, the machinery of local resistance reawakened. Newspapers sympathetic to Hale printed editorials, questioning federal jurisdiction, accusing the Bureau of political ambition. Anonymous pamphlets circulated through Fairfax and Pawhuska, portraying Hale as a victim of government overreach and depicting the Osage as ungrateful beneficiaries of federal protection. The propaganda aimed to divide public opinion and sow doubt among potential jurors. White countered with evidence, not argument. He traced bank transactions, revealing that Hale had arranged loans to men later implicated as intermediaries in the killings. He secured affidavits from merchants who had sold explosives to Hale's ranch foreman under false pretenses. Each thread connected to another until the conspiracy emerged in full outline. A network of bribery, intimidation, and calculated murder designed to convert human lives into mineral wealth. Inside the Bureau, the Osage case had become emblematic of the agency's evolving mission. Director William J. Burns, aware of growing political scrutiny, presented the investigation as proof that the federal government could enforce law where local authority failed. Reports to Washington emphasized professionalism, coordination, and the absence of sensationalism. The reality in the field remained more precarious. White's agents worked under constant threat. One informant's home was burned. Another was found dead under circumstances officially labeled suicide. The message was unmistakable. In Pawhuska, Hale awaited trial, with the confidence of a man who believed the system still belonged to him. His attorneys filed motions to suppress confessions, arguing coercion and procedural errors. They sought change of venue, claiming local prejudice against their client. They hired private investigators to shadow witnesses and undermine their credibility. Money flowed through the county, in quiet exchanges, payments for testimony, favors for jurors, bribes disguised as loans. White documented each irregularity and forwarded reports to Washington. He knew the case's integrity depended on transparency. Every bribe recorded, every threat logged, became part of the official record. The Bureau's files swelled into thousands of pages, financial ledgers, correspondence, insurance documents, and sworn statements, all organized into a narrative that even the most skilled defense could not dismantle. At the center of that narrative was greed, disciplined, and deliberate. Hale had not acted impulsively. Each killing was preceded by calculation, an insurance policy, a forged will, or a transfer of guardianship. His method resembled business strategy more than crime. The Bureau's analysts, reviewing the records, compared the murders to corporate acquisitions, each victim a step toward consolidation. The pattern illustrated a grim logic. Wealth accumulated fastest through death. For Molly Burkhart, the case represented a reckoning she had never sought. Her health, fragile but improving, allowed her to participate in the proceedings, only indirectly. The Bureau considered her both witness and victim. Her survival validated the charges. Against Hale, her losses embodied the scale of the crime. Under federal protection, she was moved to safe housing, outside Fairfax. The isolation deepened her grief, but preserved her life. The Bureau's documentation of the guardianship system exposed a broader corruption beyond Hale's circle. Auditors discovered widespread embezzlement by court-appointed guardians, many of whom had enriched themselves through inflated fees and fraudulent sales of Osage property. The revelations reached Washington, prompting congressional hearings on the management of native estates. The murders had opened a window onto structural exploitation that extended far beyond Osage County. Through the summer of 1925, White's team refined its case. Laboratory analysis confirmed the presence of nitroglycerin residue at the Smith explosion site, matching the materials purchased under Hale's name. Handwriting experts verified signatures on insurance forms. Financial examiners tracked deposits from those payments into accounts controlled by Hale and his associates. Each confirmation strengthened the framework of proof, transforming rumor into fact. As indictments approached, Hale attempted a final maneuver. From jail, he orchestrated appeals to state politicians, seeking to shift the investigation to Oklahoma jurisdiction, where his influence remained strong. Letters from sympathetic businessmen argued that federal prosecution represented an affront to state sovereignty. The Department of Justice refused. The murders, it declared, involved federal crimes under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Investigation. Public reaction shifted as the scope of the conspiracy became undeniable. National newspapers ran serialized reports on the Osage Indian murders. Readers across the country learned of the Reign of Terror, a phrase that captured both horror and fascination. The idea that wealth could invite extermination resonated far beyond Oklahoma. The Osage became symbols of vulnerability within prosperity, victims of a system that had rewarded their compliance with betrayal. In September, the federal grand jury convened in Guthrie, Oklahoma. The evidence presented filled entire tables, photographs, maps, ledgers, and affidavits, stacked in careful order. Witnesses testified under guard. Ernest Burkhart, pale and withdrawn, recounted his role under oath. He described Hale's manipulation, the promises of money, and the fear that kept him silent. His words, stripped of emotion, carried the weight of irreversible truth. The indictments followed swiftly. William K. Hale was charged with the murder of Henry Roan under federal statute, along with conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of the Smiths and Anna Brown. John Ramsey and Kelsey Morrison were charged as hired killers. Ernest Burkhart, already in custody, faced additional counts, but was promised consideration for cooperation. The formal charges marked the transformation of the Osage Murders, from rumor to recorded history. What had begun as isolated tragedies now stood revealed As an organized campaign driven by calculated greed, the Bureau's work had exposed the architecture of exploitation, how the legal mechanisms, meant to protect the Osage, had been weaponized against them. Hale's trial was scheduled for the following year. As 1925 drew to a close, Osage County existed in suspended animation. The murders had stopped, but the echoes remained. The flares of oil wells still burned across the prairie, casting light over land purchased with blood. For the first time in years, the air carried a trace of accountability. In Washington, Director Burns hailed the investigation as a milestone. The Bureau had proven its capacity to tackle complex, politically sensitive cases. Behind the rhetoric, Tom White's team continued their work, verifying details, protecting witnesses, and preparing for court. They understood that conviction was not guaranteed. Hale's resources, influence, and the volatility of Oklahoma juries posed constant risk. Within the Osage Nation, the approach of trial brought cautious hope. Families who had buried their dead began to believe that justice might reach even those who had seemed untouchable. The belief was fragile, tempered by experience, but it was enough to rekindle community meetings and public prayers. The Bureau's investigation had revealed not only the scale of the crime, but also the structure that enabled it. A system where law, money, and race intersected to erase accountability. Hale's greed had exploited that structure perfectly. Every act of violence he ordered depended on a network of officials willing to look away. The arrests did not dismantle that network. They merely exposed it to daylight. As winter approached, the agents packed their evidence into sealed trunks bound for Guthrie. The documents represented years of death distilled into numbers, signatures, and typewritten lines. The files contained no emotion, only the precision of bureaucracy, recording tragedy. Yet within those pages lay the story of a people forced to confront the limits of justice in a nation built on law. The reign of terror had reached its turning point. The investigation was complete. The trials awaited. For the Osage, the question shifted from who killed to whether the law would punish. For Tom White and his agents, the task was no longer discovery but endurance, seeing the case through to conviction against the most entrenched power the Plains had ever produced. The winter of 1926 began with silence in the Osage Hills. The oil wells still hissed and burned through the frost, but the violence that had haunted the county for 5 years had finally stopped. The men responsible sat behind iron bars, awaiting trial. The machinery of death that had operated beneath the surface of prosperity was now disassembled, its parts exposed under the light of federal scrutiny. Yet for the people who lived among those hills, the quiet carried unease. The terror had ended, but justice had yet to arrive. In a guarded cell in Guthrie, Ernest Burkhart waited under federal custody. His confession had already altered the course of the investigation. But the Bureau needed more. Details, corroboration, the full account of how greed had devoured an entire community. Tom White's agents visited repeatedly, building trust, not through promises, but through the steady presentation of evidence. Each time they returned, they carried more documents, insurance forms, bank records, and sworn statements, connecting Hale's hand to the murders. Ernest could see the pattern as clearly as they could. His name appeared everywhere, on transfers, contracts, and receipts. The trail was undeniable. In January 1926, after weeks of negotiation and review, Ernest Burkhart delivered a complete statement. He described how William Hale, under the guise of friendship and family loyalty, had orchestrated the deaths of Anna Brown, Henry Roan, and the Smiths. He explained that Hale's plan had begun years earlier, conceived when the older man realized that through inheritance, Molly's family represented a fortune worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in oil royalties. Each death would bring the remaining head rights closer to Ernest's household, where Hale could control them. Ernest's confession was methodical. He recounted how Hale arranged for John Ramsey to shoot Henry Roan, promising him a share of the insurance payout. He identified Kelsey Morrison as the man who had killed Anna Brown, lured into the act by the promise of money and protection. He detailed how Hale had ordered the explosion that destroyed the Smith home, supplying the nitroglycerin and directing others to place it beneath the bedroom floor. Every instruction had been cloaked in the language of business and obligation. Hale, the uncle who had shaped his life, had treated murder as an investment strategy. The confession broke the last barrier of denial. When it reached Washington, the Bureau transmitted it to federal prosecutors, who immediately prepared for trial. Reporters obtained excerpts, and within days newspapers across the nation printed headlines, announcing that the mystery of the Osage Murders had been solved. For the first time, the public learned that the conspiracy had not been the work of unknown criminals, but of men who dined with their victims, attended their funerals, and profited from their estates. In Pawhuska and Fairfax, the news spread through every household. For the Osage families who had buried their dead, the confession confirmed what they had long suspected, but could not prove. Grief mixed with vindication, though neither could restore what was lost. For the white residents who had admired Hale, Disbelief turned quickly to self-preservation. Few admitted to knowing him well. The civic plaques bearing his name were quietly removed. Hale maintained his innocence, refusing to acknowledge the testimony of his nephew. From his cell he dictated letters to his attorneys, insisting that the Bureau had coerced confessions through intimidation. His lawyers echoed the claim in motions filed with the court, but the evidence outweighed rhetoric. Every denial collapsed against the mountain of documentation gathered by Tom White's agents. The first trial convened in the federal courthouse in Guthrie in the spring of 1926. The prosecution presented the case of Henry Roan's murder, the cleanest in jurisdictional terms, with the life insurance policy as concrete motive. The courtroom filled with reporters, officials and spectators, drawn by the scale of the crime. On the prosecution table lay stacks of evidence. The insurance forms, signed by Hale, the weapon traced to Ramsey, and the sworn confessions linking every act to Hale's orders. The proceedings were slow and deliberate. Witness after witness described the culture of fear that had gripped the Osage Nation, the sudden deaths, and the indifference of local law enforcement. Federal agents detailed the investigation, step by step, explaining how they had traced the conspiracy through bank accounts and property records. Their testimony established the Bureau's methodical approach, presenting it as a triumph of modern policing over frontier corruption. Hale's defense focused on discrediting the witnesses. Attorneys portrayed Ramsey and Burkhart as liars seeking leniency. They questioned the authenticity of signatures and the reliability of forensic evidence. They argued that the Bureau's presence represented federal intrusion into state affairs. The courtroom became a contest between two versions of America: the old order of local autonomy, and the new federal authority asserting its reach. Outside, the town of Guthrie transformed into a spectacle of national attention. Journalists from New York and Chicago filled the hotels. The Osage delegation, seated quietly in the gallery, became a symbol for an entire nation's conscience. Their presence reminded everyone that beneath the legal proceedings lay a human cost measured in families erased. The trial lasted weeks. The jury deliberated for days and failed to reach a unanimous verdict. The result was a mistrial. Hale's lawyers celebrated, proclaiming victory and alleging bias in federal prosecution. For the Osage, the decision felt like another betrayal. The Bureau, though frustrated, regrouped. Tom White had anticipated resistance. The evidence, he knew, would survive appeal and repetition. A second trial was scheduled for late 1926 in a different venue, removed from Hale's remaining influence. This time the prosecution expanded its strategy, introducing new corroboration from additional witnesses and physical evidence recovered from the Smith explosion site. Public attention returned, drawn by the endurance of the case and the emblem it had become for justice against entrenched power. During the second trial, the government introduced Ernest Burkhart's confession in full. Reading from the record, prosecutors reconstructed the chain of orders that began with Hale's financial ambitions and ended in blood. The narrative was clinical, stripped of emotion, but overwhelming in its precision. Each fact supported the next, forming an unbroken sequence from motive to method to execution. Hale's demeanor remained unchanged throughout. Observers noted his composure, the calm expression that had once convinced entire towns of his integrity. He listened as former associates described his instructions, as bankers testified about insurance claims, and as experts traced explosive residue to materials purchased under his name. His silence, once a sign of confidence, now carried the weight of guilt. The verdict arrived in January 1929, after protracted appeals and procedural delays. Hale was convicted of the murder of Henry Roan and sentenced to life imprisonment at Leavenworth. John Ramsey received the same sentence. Ernest Burkhart, who had cooperated fully, was also sentenced to life, but later granted parole for his testimony. The trials for the Smith bombing followed similar patterns, resulting in additional convictions for those involved. When the judgment was announced, reporters described the moment as the end of the reign of terror. In reality, it marked only the legal conclusion of a tragedy that had reshaped a nation's conscience. The convictions demonstrated that justice could reach even the most powerful, but they also revealed the fragility of that justice. Many murders remained unsolved, many conspirators unpunished. The system had corrected itself only after years of inaction. Within the Bureau, the case was celebrated as a foundational achievement. Director Burns used it to justify expanded authority and modernization. Training manuals cited the Osage investigation as the model for undercover operations and evidence management. Tom White received commendation but declined public recognition. For him, the success was tempered by the knowledge of what it had cost. The files he kept contained not only the record of a solved case, but also the memory of lives destroyed before law intervened. In Osage County, the aftermath was quieter. Families rebuilt what they could. The oil continued to flow, royalties continued to arrive, and the guardianship system slowly reformed under federal oversight. But the damage was irreparable. The landscape itself seemed altered. The hills where bodies had been found, the houses reduced to rubble, the roads that had carried both wealth and death. Every familiar place carried the memory of violence. Molly Burkhart, living under federal protection, emerged as the silent survivor of her family's annihilation. Her life became a testament to endurance rather than victory. The inheritance that had once made her family targets now served as a reminder of what greed could destroy. She lived quietly, her health improving as the poisons left her body, yet her world remained defined by absence. Across the nation, the Osage Murders became shorthand for corruption and the abuse of wealth. Newspapers framed them as a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition. Politicians cited them as evidence of the need for federal oversight in matters involving Native Americans. The story entered public consciousness as both tragedy and warning, a mirror reflecting the contradictions of progress. For the Bureau, the case closed with administrative efficiency. Files were archived, agents reassigned, and reports compiled for Congress. The headlines faded as new crises emerged across the country. Yet in Osage County, the memory endured. The oil wells continued their steady rhythm, drawing from the same ground that had buried the victims. The wealth remained, but the meaning of it had changed forever. The confession that had begun as an act of desperation had become a document of national reckoning. It transformed the narrative from mystery to history, from speculation to fact. It stripped away the illusion that prosperity could coexist with impunity. When Ernest Burkhart placed his name on the final page of his statement, he not only condemned his uncle, but also revealed the moral failure of an entire era. The Bureau's victory did not erase the cost of its delay. Between the first death and the final conviction lay nearly a decade of fear and indifference. The Osage had been left to fend for themselves, while the institutions meant to protect them looked away. The trials corrected a crime, but could not redeem the neglect that had allowed it. In the years that followed, the story of the Osage Murders faded from national memory, resurfacing only when history demanded reminders. But for those who lived among the hills, the confession remained an unhealed wound, a written record of betrayal etched into the archives of justice. The reign of terror had ended in the courtroom, but its shadow continued to move across the oil fields, lingering in the silence between the rhythm of the pumps and the memory of the dead. The trials of William K. Hale unfolded over 3 long years, through venues, verdicts, and appeals that tested both the endurance of justice and the nation's attention. Each proceeding reflected a deeper struggle, not merely between prosecution and defense, but between the old world of local power and the emerging reach of federal authority. For the Bureau of Investigation, the Osage case had already proven its capacity to uncover conspiracy. Now it had to prove it could hold power accountable inside a courtroom designed by that same power. The first trial began in Guthrie, in May 1926, focusing on the murder of Henry Roan. The choice was strategic. The evidence of insurance fraud placed the crime squarely within federal jurisdiction, insulating it from Hale's influence over state courts. The prosecution, led by United States Attorney John Mathers, entered with confidence built on the Bureau's exhaustive documentation. Every witness had been briefed, every exhibit cataloged. The trial drew national reporters, their columns describing the defendant as both ranch king and accused killer. Hale entered the courtroom dressed with care, his composure unbroken. To observers, he still appeared the same community benefactor who had financed churches and schools. His attorneys emphasized that image relentlessly, portraying him as a victim of jealousy and government intrusion. They framed the Bureau's investigation as an overreach of Washington power into local affairs, arguing that the Osage had manipulated federal authorities for revenge. The argument found sympathetic ears among those who still resented federal oversight. The prosecution countered with precision. It presented the life insurance policy naming Hale as sole beneficiary, the ballistic evidence from the recovered weapon, and the confession of John Ramsey, who described carrying out the shooting under Hale's orders. Financial records corroborated Ramsey's claim, tracing the flow of insurance payments into Hale's accounts. Ernest Burkhart's earlier statement, read aloud in court, filled in the details. The defense attacked the credibility of both men, branding them unreliable and coerced. It called witnesses who claimed Hale had been elsewhere during the murder, supported by affidavits of dubious authenticity. Behind the scenes, agents reported attempted jury tampering, envelopes of cash, quiet offers of land, and veiled threats against families. The Bureau documented every incident and tightened security around jurors, but influence proved difficult to contain. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for days and failed to reach consensus. The result was a mistrial. Newspapers across the country ran the story with dismay. The New York Times called it a blow to federal law. For the Osage, it was another wound, a reminder that justice, even when armed with evidence, could still falter under the weight of privilege. Tom White and his team regrouped immediately. They anticipated that Hale's attorneys would use delay as strategy. The Bureau recommended a change of venue to avoid further interference. The second trial convened in 1928 in Oklahoma City, under tighter federal supervision and increased press coverage. This time, public opinion had shifted. The earlier mistrial had generated outrage, and editorials demanded accountability. The federal government, aware of the scrutiny, ensured the proceedings followed every procedural safeguard. The courtroom atmosphere was subdued but tense. Reporters filled the gallery. Osage representatives occupied reserved benches near the front. Molly Burkhart, recovering steadily, did not attend but remained under protection. Her name appeared frequently in testimony as the heir whose fortune had made her family a target. The prosecution reconstructed the entire narrative, beginning with the discovery of Henry Roan's body and extending through the financial trail that ended at Hale's bank accounts. It introduced new forensic analysis on the weapon and fresh corroboration of Ramsey's statements. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. The defense repeated familiar arguments, but with diminishing resonance. Hale's reputation, once a shield, now served as evidence of arrogance. Throughout the trial, Hale maintained composure, listening impassively as witnesses dismantled the life he had built. His silence drew attention, a portrait of self-control that reporters described as both dignified and chilling. The evidence, however, left little room for interpretation. The insurance policy's existence, the sequence of payments, and the corroborated confessions formed a pattern impossible to refute. In October 1929, after deliberation shorter than any previous juries, the verdict was read: guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence was life imprisonment at Leavenworth. John Ramsey received the same. Hale's expression, noted by every reporter present, did not change. He stood as the judgment was pronounced, nodded once, and was escorted from the courtroom. The conviction marked the culmination of nearly a decade of terror, investigation, and perseverance. The Bureau of Investigation had achieved what local law enforcement could not, breaking the hold of a man whose power had seemed absolute. For the Osage, the verdict represented acknowledgement rather than closure. The bodies of their families remained in the ground, the oil continued to flow, and the structures that had enabled exploitation persisted, merely subdued. Following the conviction, Hale's attorneys filed appeals. They argued that the trial had been influenced by public sentiment, and that federal jurisdiction was invalid. The appeals wound through the courts for 2 years, each motion denied in turn. The Supreme Court declined review. Hale began his life sentence in 1931, confined within the stone walls of Leavenworth, alongside other men whose names had once commanded respect beyond its gates. Ernest Burkhart, whose testimony had been pivotal, served his own sentence with less publicity. His cooperation earned eventual parole, but his reputation never recovered. He left prison a man divided by guilt and survival. For the Bureau, his role exemplified the moral complexity of informants, necessary for justice yet forever compromised by participation in the crimes they revealed. The Osage community followed the proceedings with a mixture of relief and skepticism. They had seen convictions before, only to watch them unravel. This time the finality held. The reign of terror, as the press had named it, was over. Federal control of mineral rights tightened, guardianship laws were revised, and oversight mechanisms were established to prevent recurrence. These reforms came too late for those buried in the red soil of Osage County, but stood as acknowledgement that the government bore responsibility for their deaths as much as for their wealth. In Washington, the Bureau's success elevated its standing. The Osage case became a model for investigative procedure. Reports circulated within federal departments, emphasizing the use of undercover operations, financial tracing, and coordinated prosecution. The Bureau's transformation from small office to national institution accelerated under the pressure of that success. By the decade's end, it had evolved into the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Its director, now J. Edgar Hoover, citing the Osage Murders as a defining moment in federal policing. The trials also changed public understanding of crime and power. The revelation that respected citizens had orchestrated mass murder for profit forced Americans to reconsider assumptions about justice on the frontier. The myth of the benevolent settler gave way to the reality of exploitation, hidden beneath law and religion. For the Osage, this acknowledgement came with grim satisfaction. Their suffering had exposed a system too long romanticized. After the verdict, reporters revisited the sites that had defined the story: the ravine where Anna Brown's body had been found, the ruins of the Smith home, the roads where Henry Roan had died. Each location appeared ordinary again, reclaimed by time and weather. Only the grave markers preserved their significance, silent testimony to what wealth had cost. In Leavenworth, Hale adapted to confinement with the same discipline that had once governed his empire. Prison records noted good behavior. He worked in the laundry, read newspapers, and maintained correspondence with former associates. Decades later, petitions for parole began to circulate, supported by men who still remembered his generosity. The Bureau opposed release, citing the gravity of his crimes. In 1947, despite objections, Hale was paroled after serving less than 20 years. He retired to Montana, where he lived quietly until his death. The Osage received the news with indifference. His freedom did not alter the past. By the close of the 1920s, the Osage Murders had receded from national headlines. The country faced new crises: economic collapse, labor unrest, and political scandal. Yet within law enforcement circles, The case remained a reference point, the moment when federal justice proved capable of dismantling local tyranny. For the Osage, it endured as memory, retold at gatherings, passed through generations as both warning and inheritance. The trials had revealed more than individual guilt. They exposed the structure of greed, woven through the fabric of early 20th century America. The conversion of law into commerce, of trust into transaction. The oil that had made the Osage, the richest people in the nation, had also made them targets. And their tragedy mirrored the contradictions of a country where wealth could erase morality as easily as poverty. The reign of terror ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The Bureau closed its case files, the courts completed their judgments, and the surviving Osage
returned to a life measured by caution rather than celebration.
The landscape, unchanged in its physical beauty, carried the weight of unseen graves and unspoken memory. The hills that had once seemed barren had produced both oil and blood, and the two would remain inseparable in history. For Tom White, the conclusion of the trials marked the end of his most demanding assignment. He returned to other cases, his work in Osage County, recorded in official reports, but seldom discussed. The experience left him wary of the gap between legal victory and moral restoration. Justice had been achieved by law, not by peace. The community he had helped defend would never again regard wealth as security. By 1929, the courtroom lights dimmed, and the journalists departed. The nation turned its gaze elsewhere, but in the archives of the Bureau, and in the memory of the Osage people, the record remained, a ledger of crimes committed in pursuit of inheritance, a testament to the fragility of law in the presence of greed. The trials of William K. Hale did more than convict a man. They revealed a nation's reflection in his ambition. The verdict closed a chapter of violence, but the shadow it cast would linger across generations, a reminder that justice, when delayed, carries the echo of every life it failed to protect. The 1930s began in the shadow of two verdicts that had reshaped both Oklahoma and the Bureau of Investigation. The reign of terror was officially over, but the cost of its resolution lingered in every community touched by the murders. The Osage Nation, once defined by confidence and prosperity, emerged from the decade of violence, cautious and inward-looking. The surviving families measured time not by oil dividends or leases, but by the distance between one funeral and the next. The case had ended in courtrooms hundreds of miles away, but its residue remained in the air above the hills. At Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, inmate number 32,521 began his sentence in 1931. William K. Hale entered confinement without visible emotion. Prison officials described him as compliant, intelligent, and orderly. He took to routine as easily as he had once managed his empire. His days revolved around the repetition of institutional order: mornings in the workshop, afternoons in the laundry, evenings under curfew. In reports, guards noted his polite demeanor and lack of incident. Hale's calmness unsettled them. It reflected neither remorse nor defiance, only the practiced composure of a man who believed control could not be taken from him, only relocated. John Ramsey, confined in a nearby cell block, adapted differently. Years of physical labor and poor health eroded him quickly. He spoke little and aged rapidly within the stone walls. Ernest Burkhart, held in the same prison under separate custody, lived in isolation. His cooperation during the trial had preserved his life, but cost him identity. To other inmates, he was neither criminal nor victim, merely a man whose confession had turned him into both. Outside Leavenworth, the Bureau of Investigation entered a period of rapid change. Under new leadership, it sought to institutionalize the lessons learned from Osage County. The methods pioneered by Tom White: undercover operations, evidence-based prosecution, centralized record-keeping, became standard practice. The Bureau expanded jurisdiction, armed its agents, and introduced training programs emphasizing professionalism and procedure. In 1935, it was renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, signaling permanence and authority. Within its archives, the Osage case was preserved as a foundational study, a demonstration that patient investigation could dismantle even the most fortified corruption. In Osage County, change came slowly. Federal oversight replaced local guardianship, and new regulations curtailed private control of Osage finances. Trust accounts were administered through government offices rather than individual guardians. The reforms improved transparency, but could not restore trust. The community had learned that law itself could be weaponized. Oversight offered safety, but not confidence. Molly Burkhart lived quietly through the decade. Her health stable, but her world irrevocably reduced. Federal protection ensured her safety, yet isolation defined her existence. The house that had once hosted family gatherings now stood as a memorial to those gone. Neighbors remembered her as gentle and reserved, a woman who rarely spoke of the past. She received regular payments from her surviving head rights, but rarely spent them. Wealth had ceased to symbolize security. It had become a monument to loss. Visitors to Osage County during the 1930s saw land transformed by contradiction. The oil wells still operated, their pumps rising and falling with mechanical indifference. Yet the mood of the region had shifted from exuberance to restraint. Roads once crowded with prospectors now carried federal inspectors and journalists. The same papers that had once dismissed Osage deaths as isolated tragedies now treated the county as a symbol of systemic injustice. Articles described the murders as America's black stain, a phrase that reflected both guilt and fascination. National attention moved on as the Great Depression deepened. Economic collapse consumed headlines, replacing stories of oil and murder with those of unemployment and hunger. The Osage tragedy faded from the national conversation, preserved only in official records and local memory. Within the tribe, the experience became collective history, passed quietly between generations. Elders recounted names and dates, ensuring that the deaths would not dissolve into statistics. The oral retellings carried both grief and defiance, a determination that remembrance itself was a form of justice. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Bureau continued to evolve. Director Hoover, consolidating power, used the Osage case as an example of effective federal intervention. Training lectures at Quantico referenced the investigation as a benchmark in forensic methodology. The case had proven that disciplined procedure could overcome corruption, a message Hoover repeated frequently in public speeches. Yet within the agency, veterans of the Osage investigation understood the subtler lesson that justice depended not only on method, but on the courage to act where law had failed. In 1937, Ernest Burkhart was granted parole after serving 9 years. His release drew limited attention. The press mentioned it in short columns, noting that the man whose confession had exposed a national scandal was now free. He returned to Oklahoma, but lived on the margins of the community he had helped destroy. He worked sporadically, avoided interviews, and spent much of his time in silence. The Osage neither welcomed nor rejected him. They treated him as a relic of a story too painful to revisit. His life became one of quiet obscurity, a man surviving in the aftermath of his own betrayal. Hale remained incarcerated through the decade, his appeals exhausted. His influence beyond the prison walls, though diminished, never disappeared entirely. Supporters continued to write letters asserting his innocence and requesting clemency. They described him as a man undone by politics and misunderstanding, their words echoing the same denials that had protected him for years. The petitions accumulated, but produced no result. Inside Leavenworth, time eroded the certainty that had once defined Hale's existence. Prison routine offered order but not purpose. The empire of influence he had constructed, ranchers, bankers, judges, existed now only in fading correspondence. As the decade closed, he was an aging man among younger convicts, his authority reduced to memory. For the Osage, the 1940s brought both continuity and change. World War II transformed the nation's economy, and oil regained strategic importance. The royalties flowing into Osage accounts increased again, but the memory of exploitation kept celebration muted. Federal trustees managed mineral leases with greater transparency, yet suspicion lingered that any new prosperity carried risk. The tribe invested in education, health services, and land restoration, channeling wealth toward endurance rather than display. Molly Burkhart lived to see the transformations she had paid for in blood. She remarried in later years, seeking stability rather than companionship. Her children grew to adulthood under federal guardianship, inheriting both wealth and caution. Photographs from the period show her serene but distant, a figure framed by the muted luxury of her surroundings. The Osage press rarely mentioned her by name, out of respect for privacy, but within the community she remained a living symbol of survival. In 1947, news arrived that stirred old wounds. William Hale had been paroled after serving less than 2 decades of his life sentence. The announcement came quietly, buried in the back pages of newspapers. Preoccupied with post-war reconstruction, he left Leavenworth a free man, relocating to Montana, where he lived out his remaining years under an assumed calm. The federal government issued no statement. The Bureau archived his file and moved on to new cases. For the Osage, the parole confirmed what they had always known, that the machinery of justice could punish, but not fully atone. Hale's release reopened discussion within the community about restitution. Tribal leaders petitioned the government for audits of past royalties and for recognition of mismanagement that had compounded their losses. These efforts culminated decades later in settlements, acknowledging federal negligence in the handling of tribal assets. The roots of those actions lay in the scars of the 1920s. The Bureau, now fully the Federal Bureau of Investigation, continued to reference the Osage Murders as an institutional milestone. Internal publications praised the investigation as the agency's first great triumph. Yet the agents who had served under Tom White rarely spoke of it. They understood that victory had come only after years of suffering that could not be undone. White himself retired from the Bureau and later served as warden of Leavenworth, a position that placed him within the same institution that held and later released William Hale. The irony did not escape him. During those years, White maintained correspondence with former colleagues who had served with him in Osage County. Their letters discussed procedural reforms, not the case's moral dimension. It was as though the Bureau had absorbed the lesson of efficiency, while discarding the lesson of empathy. The Osage Murders became a closed file, a story of professional success detached from human tragedy. By the end of the 1940s, the Reign of Terror had receded into the category of history. Few outside Oklahoma remembered the details, fewer still understood the scale. The oil continued to flow, and new generations grew up, surrounded by prosperity that rested on graves. The official record ended with the convictions, but memory persisted in families, photographs, and the quiet rituals of remembrance. The price of justice, measured in years and lives, remained high. The trials had proven that law could triumph, but they had also revealed how deeply injustice could entrench itself within legality. The Osage had been murdered, not outside the law, but through it, through wills, guardianships, and contracts designed to protect them. The Bureau's investigation had exposed that paradox, but the nation had yet to confront its implications. In the broader sweep of American history, the Osage Murders stood as a bridge between eras, between the frontier myth of local autonomy and the modern assertion of federal responsibility. The Bureau that emerged from Osage County would grow into a symbol of national order, yet beneath its institutional pride lay the memory of how it had been born, from the blood of those whom the law had failed. By the close of the 1940s, the hills of Osage County appeared peaceful again. The derricks turned against the sky, the roads stretched quiet under the sun, and the cemeteries lay neatly kept. But for those who lived there, peace was not absence of fear. It was vigilance refined by history. Every well that produced oil, every bank statement, issued under federal supervision, was a reminder of what justice had cost and how late it had arrived. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of the Osage Murders had receded into the background of American memory. The nation, preoccupied with new wars and new ambitions, moved forward, while the past remained unspoken. Newspapers that had once filled their pages with accounts of the trials now devoted columns to atomic power and spaceflight. The oil fields of Oklahoma still burned against the night sky, but their light no longer illuminated the history beneath them. The Reign of Terror became a rumor folded into local folklore, preserved only in the recollections of those who had lived through it. In Osage County, the passage of time covered scars but did not erase them. The wells still pumped wealth from the red earth, but the meaning of that wealth had changed. For the generation born after the 1930s, the stories of betrayal and murder were family legends, whispered warnings told in low voices at gatherings, reminders that money and trust had once proven fatal companions. The descendants of the victims grew up surrounded by photographs of relatives whose faces they never knew. Each framed portrait represented not nostalgia, but evidence. William K. Hale died in 1962 in Montana, far from the land that had made and destroyed him. His death drew little attention beyond a few lines in regional papers. To most Americans, his name meant nothing. Within the Osage community, the news spread quietly. Some regarded it as an end, others as confirmation that justice, however late, had the final word. No ceremony marked his passing. He was buried in unremarkable soil, his wealth dissipated, his reputation erased. Ernest Burkhart lived longer. After years of obscurity, he returned to Osage County, residing quietly on the edges of the community he had betrayed. His parole had been controversial but irreversible. He avoided conversation about the past and lived as a man suspended between guilt and forgetfulness. Those who saw him in later years described a figure diminished by silence. In 1965, the governor of Oklahoma granted him a full pardon, a gesture that provoked little reaction. By then, most of the nation had forgotten why his name mattered. Tom White, the former bureau agent who had led the investigation, spent his later life away from public notice. After serving as warden of Leavenworth, he retired to Texas, where he lived until 1971. He maintained the habits of discipline that had guided his career: regular routines, meticulous correspondence, and quiet faith. He never sought attention for the Osage case, though he preserved his notes and reports with archival precision. To younger agents who occasionally visited, he represented a link to an earlier era of investigation, when justice depended on patience rather than spectacle. Molly Burkhart lived into the 1940s, long enough to see Hale imprisoned and then paroled. Her death closed the direct line to the generation that had endured the Reign of Terror. Her descendants inherited both her wealth and her restraint. They spoke seldom of the murders, understanding that remembrance carried pain as well as pride. Within Osage families, silence became a form of protection, a way to contain the past without reopening it. The bureau that had once uncovered the conspiracy had grown into a national institution. Its archives held the complete record of the Osage Murders: transcripts, evidence lists, photographs, and affidavits, stored in Washington under classification headings few would ever see. Within the agency's official history, the case was summarized in brief paragraphs as an early success. The moral dimension, the human devastation that had shaped the investigation, remained unrecorded. For decades, No books were written about the murders. University courses on Oklahoma history passed over them in a few sentences. Journalists rarely mentioned the events except as curiosity. The combination of native suffering, rural setting, and the absence of continuing trials consigned the case to obscurity. The nation preferred narratives of progress, of technological triumph, of urban growth, of the American century. The Osage tragedy did not fit that image. It revealed a truth, too uncomfortable for celebration, that greed could thrive within legality, and that justice, when delayed, left wounds that prosperity could not heal. Still, memory survived underground. Within the Osage Nation, elders maintained the record through oral history. They recited names, dates, and places with the precision of archivists. In ceremonies and family meetings, they spoke of Anna Brown, Lizzie Q, Henry Roan, Rita and Bill Smith, and the dozens whose deaths had never reached a courtroom. The repetition of those names became ritual, an act of resistance against erasure. To remember was to assert continuity, to refuse to allow the dead to vanish behind official silence. By the 1970s, a new generation of historians began to rediscover the forgotten story. Access to Bureau archives under the Freedom of Information Act revealed files long sealed from public view. The documents astonished researchers with their scale. Thousands of pages detailing not just murder but the entire machinery of exploitation that had surrounded the Osage for decades. Scholars recognized that the case represented more than a regional crime. It was a national parable of power and neglect. Yet even with publication, public awareness remained limited. The memory surfaced briefly in academic journals before sinking again beneath the larger currents of American history. In Osage County, the oil economy declined, and the wealth that had once drawn opportunists diminished. The community turned its energy towards self-governance, reclaiming administrative control from federal trustees. With that control came renewed examination of the past. Tribal historians compiled records, gathered oral testimonies, and visited archives to piece together a complete account. They understood that history, once allowed to vanish, could return only through deliberate effort. The 1980s and 1990s brought gradual recognition. Articles appeared in regional newspapers, revisiting the mystery murders of the 1920s. Descendants of victims and investigators contributed interviews. The surviving photographs of the victims, sepia portraits, once stored in drawers, were reproduced in print, their faces confronting readers across time. For younger generations of the Osage Nation, these rediscoveries transformed tragedy into identity. The story became part of the curriculum in local schools, a warning about complacency and an assertion of endurance. Hale's name reappeared briefly in historical accounts, but carried no redemption. His crimes, though decades old, remain clear in archival record. The Bureau files, released piecemeal, revealed correspondence showing the persistence of corruption and obstruction during the original trials. The exposure reinforced what the Osage had always known, that the conspiracy had been larger than any single man, a system of exploitation disguised as governance. As the century neared its end, the silence that had followed the murders finally began to break. Authors and journalists visited Osage County, drawn by the strange intersection of prosperity and loss. They interviewed descendants, reviewed case files, and reconstructed the events that had once transfixed the nation. Their work transformed the story from private memory to public history again, forcing acknowledgement of what had been buried beneath half a century of denial. The reopening of the narrative coincided with a broader cultural reckoning. Across the United States, the late 20th century brought renewed scrutiny of historical injustices against Native Americans. The Osage Murders, once dismissed as a footnote, emerged as central evidence of how federal systems of protection had often enabled exploitation. Museums curated exhibits, universities hosted panels, and in Osage County memorial projects took form. The red earth that had soaked the blood of the victims became ground for remembrance. In 1995, a group of Osage scholars and descendants organized the first comprehensive memorial ceremony for the victims of the Reign of Terror. It was held quietly, attended by families and officials. The event was not a celebration but an acknowledgement. Candles were lit for each confirmed victim, and prayers were spoken for those whose names remained unknown. The ceremony reasserted what history had long obscured, that justice had been partial, and memory was the only permanence left. By the close of the century, the Osage Murders had re-entered national awareness through journalism and literature. The public, encountering the story anew, responded with shock that such events had ever occurred. For the Osage, the rediscovery was not revelation but recognition. They had carried the story for decades, waiting for the rest of the nation to remember. Through those years of silence and rediscovery, one truth remained constant. The Reign of Terror had been both a crime and a mirror. It reflected the contradictions of a country that celebrated progress while permitting exploitation. The wealth drawn from Osage land had built towns and fortunes, but it had also revealed the moral vacancy at the heart of that prosperity. Every rediscovery of the story forced America to look again at itself, and measure the distance between law and justice. The 20th century ended much as the story had begun. Beneath the same Oklahoma sky, the same rolling hills, the same wells pulling oil from the earth. But now the memory of what had happened there was no longer confined to whispers. It existed in print, in archives, in classrooms, and in the living words of the Osage Nation. The silence that had followed the trials was finally broken, replaced by a quiet insistence that history, once faced, could not be forgotten again. At the dawn of the 21st century, the Osage Murders lay dormant within archives and memory, preserved in documents that few had read, and in families that had never forgotten. The story existed in fragments, yellowed case files, fading photographs, and whispered recollections passed between generations. For most Americans, the reign of terror was unknown, buried beneath decades of silence and distraction. Yet history, however deeply buried, has a way of returning when the present begins to resemble the past. In 2011, a journalist named David Gran traveled to Osage County to research what he had heard described only as the murders. The Bureau's records, released under Freedom of Information requests, provided the skeleton of events, but the bones of the story, the people, their grief, their endurance, remained in the living memory of the Osage Nation. Gran's arrival marked the moment when the forgotten history of the 1920s re-entered national consciousness. His work would expand beyond journalism into a sweeping historical investigation, bridging the gap between archival evidence and human experience. He found a landscape still marked by absence. The oil fields continued their slow labor, though most had passed into corporate control. The towns, Pawhuska, Fairfax, Greyhorse, carried the modest stillness of rural America, yet each held the invisible geography of loss. The ravine where Anna Brown had been found was overgrown with grass. The site of the Smith House explosion was marked only by the subtle rise of uneven ground. In these quiet places, Gran met descendants who kept the memory alive not through museums or monuments, but through the continuity of family. Their recollections formed the oral bridge between history and the present. His research culminated in Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI, published in 2017. The title captured both the beauty and the violence of the story, the blooming of wildflowers in spring and the killing that followed. The book reconstructed the events with precision, weaving together the lives of the victims, the arrogance of the perpetrators, and the slow awakening of federal justice. For the first time in nearly a century, the Reign of Terror returned to national attention, not as a mystery, but as a central chapter in the American narrative. Readers encountered the story with disbelief. The idea that a community had been systematically murdered for oil wealth, under the protection of law, challenged the mythology of the nation itself. The case revealed that progress and exploitation had advanced hand in hand. The book's success turned history into collective reckoning. Universities introduced courses on the Osage Murders, journalists revisited archives, and public conversations shifted toward recognition of how deeply racial and economic hierarchies had shaped American modernity. Within the Osage Nation, the renewed attention brought mixed emotion. For many, the rediscovery validated what families had preserved in silence, that their ancestors had been victims, not of isolated violence, but of a calculated conspiracy. Yet the exposure also reopened wounds. The images of the murdered, long kept private, now circulated widely. The community navigated the difficult balance between remembrance and dignity, between telling the truth and being defined by tragedy. Osage leaders approached the resurgence of interest with deliberation. They organized memorials that centered on resilience rather than victimhood, ensuring that the story belonged first to the Osage people, not to outsiders interpreting their history. The Reign of Terror became a touchstone for discussions of sovereignty, trust management, and cultural renewal. The wealth that had once drawn predators now funded education, preservation, and artistic expression. In schools, children learned both the language of their ancestors and the lessons of their history. That survival required not silence, but storytelling. A film adaptation of Gran's book, directed by Martin Scorsese and released in 2023, extended the reach of that remembrance. It presented the Osage story on the scale of mythic tragedy, shot on location in Oklahoma, featuring Osage actors, and produced with the consultation of tribal historians. The film's release brought the faces and landscapes of Osage County to audiences worldwide. For many viewers, it was their first encounter with a chapter of history long omitted from textbooks. For the Osage community, it represented both recognition and reclamation. The story that had once been told about them was now told with them. The attention sparked broader examination of the federal government's historical role in Native affairs. Congressional hearings revisited trust mismanagement and land rights, citing the Osage case as the earliest and most devastating example of systemic exploitation. Scholars traced direct lines from the guardianship laws of the 1920s to ongoing inequities in resource distribution and self-determination. The Bureau, now the FBI, issued official statements, acknowledging the case's place in its institutional history. On the agency's website, the section titled Famous Cases and Criminals included the Osage Murders, describing them as one of the earliest major successes in federal investigative history. But for the Osage people, the story remained more than a chapter in law enforcement history. It was living memory. Descendants of the victims visited graves that had once been neglected, leaving flowers and stones. Annual commemorations became community rituals. Elders spoke of the Reign of Terror, not as a closed wound, but as a source of collective strength. The murders had sought to erase them. Survival itself was defiance. The early 21st century also brought a new kind of reckoning. The realization that the structure enabling those crimes had never fully vanished. Across the United States, Native communities continued to face resource disputes, environmental damage, and political marginalization. The Osage story, retold in books and film, served as warning and mirror. That wealth extracted from the earth often comes at the expense of those who belong to it. As awareness grew, so did introspection. Historians, journalists, and citizens began to question how such a vast conspiracy could have remained hidden for so long. The answer lay not in secrecy, but in indifference. The quiet collusion of those who had benefited from looking away. The Reign of Terror had been possible because it was convenient to ignore. That same complacency, many argued, still existed in different forms. In Osage County, the physical landscape changed less than the moral one. The oil wells continued to operate, but new enterprises rose alongside them. Cultural centers, art installations, and language schools, funded by tribal initiatives. The Osage Nation leveraged its economic power to reclaim its narrative. The land that had once been the site of grief became the ground of assertion. Visitors who arrived seeking the scene of the crimes encountered instead a thriving community that refused to be defined by victimhood. The FBI's archives, digitized in the 2010s, made the original investigation files accessible to scholars. Thousands of pages, once confined to dusty folders, became available to the public, each report revealing the granular detail of the Bureau's early operations. The correspondence between agents, the photographs of evidence, the transcripts of confessions, all illuminated the scale of the crime and the professionalism that had finally dismantled it. Yet reading those records also exposed how late justice had arrived, how many warnings had been ignored before the Bureau acted. For many readers, the files read as both triumph and indictment. By the 2020s, nearly a century after Anna Brown's death, Osage County had become a place of pilgrimage for historians, filmmakers, and descendants. The past was no longer hidden, but displayed openly in museums, memorials, and guided tours through the landscapes where history had unfolded. The ravine where Anna's body was found was now part of a protected area, marked by a plaque that told the story in unflinching terms. Visitors stood before it not as tourists, but as witnesses. The long arc from silence to remembrance reached its culmination in these years. What had once been buried beneath fear and bureaucracy had returned to the surface, transformed into education and art. The Reign of Terror was no longer an untold tragedy, but a recognized chapter in the nation's moral history. The Osage people, who had carried the memory through generations of silence, finally saw their story acknowledged in classrooms, court documents, and cinema screens. Yet even in recognition, the story retained its weight. The Osage Murders remained a caution rather than a comfort, a reminder that progress built on injustice carries the seeds of its own corruption. The same soil that had produced oil and death still sustained life and renewal. The difference lay in who told the story and why. By 2025, the centennial of the murders approached. The Osage Nation prepared a series of memorial events, lectures, exhibitions, and ceremonies, honoring the victims and reaffirming survival. The FBI contributed archival materials, and the federal government issued formal acknowledgments of historical failure. The acts of remembrance were solemn but resolute, not mourning, but continuity. The Reign of Terror had intended to end a people. Instead, it had become the reason their story endured. Under the wide Oklahoma sky, the same hills stood unchanged, the same wind, the same grass, the same red soil. Yet the silence that once protected the guilty now belonged to the living, not as fear, but as reflection. The story that began in darkness had returned to light, carried forward by those who refused to let it vanish again. A century after the Reign of Terror began, the hills of Osage County remain quiet beneath the same pale sky. Oil still rises from the earth, though its presence feels subdued, more echo than engine. The land that once made a people the richest in America now carries a different wealth. The weight of remembrance, the wells, the roads, and the houses, still trace the geography of loss, but time has softened their edges. What remains is not absence, but endurance, a quiet insistence that the story will never again return to silence. In the morning light, the land appears unchanged. The slow roll of prairie, the distant shimmer of pump jacks, the rhythmic sway of grass. Beneath that surface lies the sediment of history, the bones, the signatures, the ledgers, the testimonies, all that once defined the intersection of greed and governance. The Osage murders were never only a crime, they were a revelation of how progress could disguise predation, how law could fail even while functioning, and how justice, when delayed, could never fully heal. The bureau that once entered Osage County as a fledgling agency has long since become a symbol of national power. The case that formed its foundation remains recorded in its archives as one of its earliest triumphs. Yet in the quiet honesty of history, triumph and tragedy are inseparable. The Bureau's intervention exposed a conspiracy, but did so only after years of death. The Osage people had already paid the price for the nation's awakening. The modern FBI cites the case as its beginning. The Osage remember it as the near end of theirs. Both are true. Every anniversary of the murders draws reflection. The ceremonies held across Osage County are solemn but unsentimental. Candles are lit for each confirmed victim. Anna Brown, Lizzie Q, Henry Roan, Rita and Bill Smith, and for the many whose deaths were never proven, but felt in the lineage of families. At each service, the names are spoken aloud, restoring individuality to those reduced to case numbers and depositions. The act transforms history into presence. Memory in this place is not passive. It is a living declaration that those lost were not erased. The descendants of the victims and of the investigators sometimes stand side by side at these gatherings. Time has leveled the distance between them, replacing accusation with shared recognition. The past no longer demands vengeance, it demands understanding. Historians, students, and officials attend not to commemorate victory, but to confront the persistence of the structures that made such crimes possible. The guardianship system that enabled Hale's empire has been dismantled, yet the tension between protection and control remains part of the national dialogue. Each retelling of the Osage story reopens that conversation. The oil beneath the reservation, once the source of both prosperity and death, continues to produce revenue for the tribe. The funds now support education, healthcare, and cultural revival. Children learn the Osage language, sing the old songs, and study the history their ancestors were denied the chance to tell. In classrooms, the reign of terror is taught not as tragedy alone, but as the crucible from which modern Osage identity emerged. The same story that once represented victimization now embodies endurance. Across America, the rediscovery of the Osage murders has transformed them into moral parable. Universities teach the case as an early example of systemic injustice disguised as legality. Museums display artifacts, letters, photographs, fragments of clothing, each an object heavy with the knowledge of how civilization can consume those it claims to uplift. The images are quiet, the captions factual, no sensationalism remains, only the blunt evidence of history's cost. The physical remnants of the investigation still exist. In Washington, the Bureau's file cabinets hold the original reports of Tom White and his agents. The paper, yellowed and brittle, bears the handwriting of men who once believed they were defining a new kind of law. In Pawhuska, the courthouse stands unchanged, its brick facade weathered but intact. Tourists walk the same steps where Hale once entered, the same corridors where witnesses waited, the same courtroom where the verdict was read. The building has become both monument and warning, a reminder that law is only as strong as the conscience that applies it. Beyond the official record lies the greater truth. The Osage endured not because justice was delivered, but because memory was kept. Every generation that carried the story forward did so without assurance that anyone outside the tribe would listen. Their persistence ensured that when the nation was finally ready to hear, the story still existed to be told. The continuity between silence and speech, between loss and survival, forms the moral spine of the century that followed. In national memory, the Osage murders now occupy the uneasy space, reserved for lessons learned too late. They stand beside the other reckonings of American history. Moments when the country recognized, through the suffering of others, the limits of its ideals. The reign of terror forces reflection on the nature of wealth and the ethics of progress. It asks how a society that prizes success can distinguish enterprise from exploitation, and how long it can afford not to. For the Osage, remembrance is not ceremony alone. It is woven into the rhythms of daily life. The community that once lived under siege now thrives with quiet strength. Modern buildings rise beside historic homes. Art galleries display Osage painters, and powwows fill the air with music that once risked being lost. Each new generation walks upon land layered with history. Land that holds both the wealth of minerals and the weight of memory. The coexistence of those forces defines Osage identity. The descendants of the perpetrators, too, live within that history. Some have confronted it publicly, offering acknowledgement without defense. Others remain silent, unwilling to reopen the past. The geography of guilt and grief intermingles in a landscape too small to separate innocence from inheritance. The crimes of the 1920s no longer belong to individuals. They belong to the moral record of a nation that allowed them. In academic circles, scholars trace the evolution of justice from Osage County to the modern era. They note how the Bureau's response shaped investigative standards, how the exposure of corruption influenced native policy, and how the concept of federal jurisdiction expanded in its wake. Yet in these analyses, one element often resists quantification: the human cost measured in silence, the decades when the world did not listen. The space between the murders and their rediscovery remains a void in national conscience, an interval that mirrors the country's recurring pattern of forgetting and remembering. The Reign of Terror's legacy endures in its questions more than its answers. What does it mean to be protected by law that serves others first? How does a nation reconcile prosperity built on injustice? How many years must pass before acknowledgement becomes amends? These questions echo beyond Osage County, shaping every debate where wealth and power intersect with accountability. The story's relevance persists because its pattern repeats in different forms, under different names, across different landscapes. In the archives of the Osage Nation Museum, a wall displays photographs of those who died between 1921 and 1926. Each portrait bears a name once nearly lost to bureaucracy. Visitors stand before them in silence, not out of awe, but respect. The air carries the stillness of testimony. Outside, the prairie stretches into distance, the same horizon that framed the beginning of the story. The land remains beautiful, indifferent, and enduring, a witness beyond judgment. Time has converted the Reign of Terror from event into inheritance. It no longer belongs only to the Osage, but to all who study the fragility of justice. Its lesson lies in the recognition that the law, without empathy, becomes machinery, and that truth, without memory, becomes myth. The Osage refused both fates. They turned survival into resistance, grief into education, and silence into story. As the centennial ceremonies conclude, the evening settles over Osage County, much as it did 100 years earlier. The oil flares burn softly in the distance, their lights subdued against the dark. The wind moves through the grass, carrying the faint rustle of continuity. Beneath the ground, the minerals remain, unchanged, indifferent. Above them, the people endure, descendants of those who were meant to vanish, stewards of a history the world almost forgot. The century that began in greed ends in remembrance. The names that once appeared only in coroner's reports now stand inscribed in stone and memory. The Reign of Terror has become both a wound and a warning, a measure of how far justice can travel and how long it takes to arrive. History does not close in Osage County. It breathes. Each generation returns to the story not to relive it, but to understand it anew. In the weight of that understanding lies the only true form of justice left, the endurance of memory, in the place where silence once reigned.